Ryan Moore lived in a sleek, modern mansion in an upscale neighborhood where glass walls overlooked the valley, and every morning sunlight poured in as if someone had flipped a switch. He was 42, the founder of a tech startup once valued at over $300 million before it was sold to a major corporation. Ryan hadn't needed to work for money in years, but he still did. Not to live, but because he didn't know what else to do. His schedule was managed by 2 personal assistants. A private driver took him anywhere he needed to go. A private chef prepared 3 meals a day. A home gym, a heated pool, a full voice-controlled smart system, anything that could make life more comfortable, he had it. But people said, Ryan Moore is the loneliest man in the most perfect house. He wasn't the type to isolate himself. In fact, he once dated a well-known interior designer. They met at an upscale art exhibition downtown. She was smart, sharp, and ambitious. Their relationship lasted more than a year, until he realized most of their conversations revolved around what he owned. Then there was an actress, nearly 15 years younger, beautiful, charming, full of life. Everything felt fun until he accidentally saw a message she sent to a friend. Let's be real, I wouldn't be here if he wasn't Ryan Moore. After that came a marketing manager, then a yoga instructor. Each time Ryan thought he'd found something real, it ended in disappointment. Gradually, he stopped expecting anything. He still went on dates, still talked, still acted polite and kind. But inside, Ryan had built a wall of invisible glass around himself. Everyone could see him, but no one could touch him. Friends still texted him, inviting him out for golf, wine parties, weekend trips to Napa. A few close friends, the ones who still remembered the days before he was the tech millionaire, when he was just a college kid in worn-out Converse, would sometimes tease, "Hey, anyone managed to melt that stone heart of yours yet?" He'd just smile and shake his head. Among his circles, people started jokingly calling him Stone-Hearted Ryan. Not because he was cruel or cold, but because no one was close enough to really know him anymore. Someone once said, "A guy like Ryan Moore will probably end up marrying an AI or a robot." Maybe they were right, because after all those relationships, he'd come to believe that real emotion wasn't meant for people like him. They loved his image, his success, his lifestyle, his status. But no one ever asked, who is Ryan Moore when you take all that away? In an interview 2 years ago, when asked, what makes you feel the loneliest? Ryan paused for a few seconds before answering, "It's not that I don't have anyone. It's that I don't want anyone anymore." That answer was quoted in countless LinkedIn posts and startup magazines. People praised him for being profound, but no one knew it was the truest thing he'd ever said. And he believed that would never change, until someone showed up, quietly, without trying to stand out. Yet somehow, she began to catch Ryan's attention, even though he never meant for it to happen. Grace, around 30, had been hired as a nanny for Noah, Ryan's only nephew, who was staying at his house while his parents were abroad on a long work assignment. Grace wasn't new to the job. Her resume was spotless, her experience solid, and every family she'd worked for had left glowing reviews. But what made Grace different wasn't written on paper. She wasn't beautiful in the kind of way that made people turn their heads. Her brown hair was always tied neatly, her skin wasn't fair, her eyes not particularly large, and she never wore lipstick. Her clothes were tidy and clean, but not what anyone would call fashionable. If you passed her on the street, you might not even remember her face. She didn't talk much either. She didn't share opinions about everything like so many others who had come into that house. She didn't force a smile, didn't try to be charming, didn't touch anything she didn't need to. She came, did her job, quietly. But that quietness wasn't dull. Within just a few days, the house staff noticed that Grace was always the first to sense when someone wasn't feeling well, sometimes even before that person realized it themselves. The day the housekeeper forgot the cold storage key, Grace was the one who left a note on the counter with the key beside it, before he even knew he'd misplaced it. One day, when the weather suddenly turned cold, Grace quietly placed a light scarf on the old gardener's chair, simply because she'd seen him sneeze once while watering the plants. With Noah, the 8-year-old boy who was used to video games and smartphones, Grace never tried to win his attention with expensive toys or tech gadgets. She told stories. Not ones from books, but ones she made up herself. About a boy who could talk to animals, or a bicycle that could sing. Noah laughed every time. He started putting his phone aside. One day, when Ryan asked, Did you have a good day? Noah nodded and said simply, Grace makes me happy. At first, Ryan didn't think much of it. He was used to people coming and going, assistants, housekeepers, staff, all doing their jobs, then leaving when their contracts ended. Grace was just another part of the well-oiled system of his life. Nothing more. But then, small details began to catch his attention. She never entered his room unless she was asked to. She never left any trace of her presence in his private space. No personal questions, no lingering glances that crossed a line. She didn't try to be friendly, nor did she force herself to be professionally polite. She was simply herself, quiet, but always there when needed. And that was exactly what made Ryan start to notice. Because everyone who had ever gotten close to him had always tried to show something. But she chose not to. Once, he overheard her speaking to the cook. Are you feeling better today? A bit better, thank you. I made you some warm water with lemon. There's more in the kitchen if you need it. A small, ordinary exchange. But Ryan stopped in the hallway and listened for a few seconds. He started noticing how those kinds of questions repeated every day. Never showy. Never meant to prove she cared. And he began to wonder, what kind of person lives in a way that makes everyone around them feel a little lighter? Grace wanted nothing from him. She didn't try to impress. She didn't act like a guest in the mansion. But she also never crossed the line. She wasn't afraid of him. Yet she never acted overly familiar either. She made people feel respected, simply through her quiet presence. And Ryan realized it had been a very long time since he'd met anyone like that. Lately, Ryan had developed a habit of waking up earlier than usual. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the stacked meeting schedule, or maybe it was Noah's laughter drifting up from downstairs each morning that stirred him awake. This morning was no different. As he walked into the kitchen, still in his gray pajamas and with uncombed hair, he reached for a bottle of water. Then his eyes caught on something unusual sitting on the wooden table by the window. A small card, no envelope, placed neatly beside the vase of flowers. He glanced around. The kitchen was empty. No sound of staff, no smell of breakfast. Everything was quiet, just like every other early morning in this house. Curious, he picked up the card. It wasn't one of those store-bought cards with bright patterns and shiny prints, just a folded piece of white cardstock, handwritten in simple black ink. The handwriting was small, neat, slightly tilted to the right. He opened it. Happy birthday, Mr. Moore. I hope today you laugh. Even just once. You don't know this, but you've inspired more than you think. From someone who sees you, quietly. Ryan stood still. There was no background music, no applause, no birthday cake on the table like the ones carefully arranged by assistants or business partners. Just a card, a wish, 3 short sentences, no signature. But Ryan recognized the handwriting. No doubt about it, it was Grace's. He'd seen it before on little notes she'd left for the gardener, for Noah, for the delivery guy. All written in that same neat, patient, unhurried style. There was nothing else with the card. No gift, no expectation, no hint of, I did something for you, now it's your turn. Just a quiet message that said, I see you. Ryan couldn't remember the last time someone had wished him a happy birthday. Genuinely, without any social motive. Every party he'd ever had was arranged by his assistant. Guests came for networking, for reputation. The gifts always carried company logos or luxury brand names. The birthday wishes were all identical. Wish you success and happiness. No one had ever said, I hope you laugh today, even just once. And certainly, no one had ever written, you don't know this, but you've inspired more than you think. Ryan sat down, still holding the card in his hand. A small gesture, maybe 2 minutes to write, yet it made his whole morning stand still. Not because he was suddenly moved to tears, but because he was confused. He had never been seen like this before. Not seen for his success, not for his wealth, not for being Ryan Moore, but seen simply as a person. Grace didn't say a word. She never mentioned the card when she saw him that morning. She was exactly the same, helping Noah with breakfast, checking his backpack, reminding him of a few things before the driver took him to school. She didn't look at Ryan any differently, didn't expect anything in return, and that made the card feel even heavier. It wasn't a gift, it was a touch, light, but real. And it had been a very long time since anything had touched Ryan that deeply. He left the card on the table at first, just as it was. But that night, before going to bed, he took it with him. Not to show anyone, just because he didn't want someone else to throw it away. Since the day he received the card, Ryan hadn't said anything about it. He didn't react, didn't bring it up. but his eyes began to linger a little longer whenever Grace walked by. He didn't look at her the way a man usually looks at a woman. It was more like he was trying to decode something that didn't exist in his life's data before. He started quietly observing her, and the first thing he noticed was that the gentleness she showed Noah didn't come from duty but from genuine care. She was never in a rush with the boy. When Noah spilled milk on the table, she didn't scold him, didn't sigh. She just looked at him and said, "It's okay. Now you know what to do next time, right?" Then she cleaned up the mess as if it were the smallest thing that could happen in a day. Grace never complained. She never mentioned having a sore back, never talked about being tired, never grumbled about being asked to do too many things. Every day, she did her job exactly, and often more than that. One night, Ryan noticed her still in the laundry room near midnight, neatly folding small towels. No one had told her to do it, but she did it anyway. Once, when the weather suddenly turned cold, Ryan's assistant called a driver to pick everyone up from a family gathering. When the car returned, Ryan asked casually, "Did Grace get home?" The driver shook his head. She walked, didn't ask for a ride. Ryan stood still for a few seconds, then simply said, "Next time it's this cold, ask if she needs a ride." He didn't say anything more, but his mind wouldn't let go of the image. Grace walking alone through the early winter chill, carrying Noah's small backpack and her own fabric tote filled with the few things she always brought along. Grace seemed to accept her invisible role as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She never tried to stand out, never left any trace of herself in the space. No perfume scent, no clicking heels, no echo of phone conversations filling the house like so many other women who had once lived there. Ryan began to feel confused. He was a man who could always see the motive behind people's actions, but with Grace, he couldn't read anything at all. Why did she write the card? Why did she leave it there without saying a word? Why didn't she act any differently after he'd seen it? He tried to put himself in her place, but it didn't fit any behavioral pattern he knew. She didn't want praise. She wasn't waiting to be noticed. She didn't expect gratitude. She simply did it, and then let it be. Grace kept behaving exactly the same. No different look in her eyes, no change in her tone, no avoiding him, no hint of waiting for a reaction. Every morning, she still had breakfast with Noah, reminded him to bring his jacket, checked in with the cook, double-checked his backpack before the car arrived. Ryan watched it all in silence, and somehow, that silence made him see more. He wasn't even sure what he was seeing, but for the first time in a very long while, he didn't feel like he was standing outside of everything. He was watching someone who didn't try to be seen, yet somehow made it impossible not to notice her. No one said a word. There was no conversation about the card, no explanation. But ever since that morning, something had begun to shift. So small, it could easily go unnoticed, unless you were paying very close attention. Ryan started adjusting his meeting schedule, not cutting back on work, just shifting late meetings to early mornings or midday so he could be home around dinner time. Sometimes all he did was sit at the table for a few minutes with Noah and Grace, asking something simple like, "Anything fun happen at school today?" But his presence alone made a difference. Grace didn't react. She continued caring for Noah, organizing everything as usual, but her eyes, in one brief moment, seemed to hold a quiet acknowledgement. Not gratitude, not a brighter smile, just silence, but a silence that carried depth. One afternoon when a light rain began to fall, the driver was called to the gate and noticed Ryan's car already parked there. On the passenger seat sat an umbrella and a light scarf. Ryan said nothing, just gestured, "The car's for Grace." No one needed to ask who had given the order. The head chef in the house began receiving small requests. "Tonight, make white bean soup and lightly toasted bread." It wasn't one of Ryan's favorites, but it was the dish Grace had once mentioned to Noah, how her mother used to make it whenever the weather turned cold. Grace never asked why it appeared on the table. She just glanced at it once, paused for a few seconds, then went on setting the plates as usual. Another evening, Ryan left a small note on the kitchen counter, the spot where Grace usually stopped for warm water after finishing her chores. It said simply, "Thanks for the card." No signature, no date. But Ryan's handwriting was unmistakable. The next morning, the note was gone. No response, no message left in return. But when Ryan entered his office, there was a small book placed neatly on his desk. No wrapping, no note, just an old paperback with the title, "Quiet is a Strength." Ryan flipped open the first page. No inscription, no identifying marks, but the way the book was placed, exactly where he usually left his keys and phone, told him it hadn't been forgotten there. From that day on, he began noticing small things appear now and then. A slip of paper with a meaningful quote, a box of herbal tea near the water dispenser, a soft cloth for cleaning glasses, the kind he often used but always forgot to buy. No one mentioned what was happening. No one changed how they addressed each other or behaved in public. Everything stayed within its proper boundaries. And yet, a different kind of air began to form quietly between them, like a faint current running underground, invisible but enough to make the trees begin to change seasons. Grace never stepped into Ryan's space, and Ryan never tried to claim hers. They simply moved alongside each other, and both of them knew. But there was no need to name it, because some feelings, when they're real, don't need words to be understood. No one put a name to what they had. There were no confessions, no clarifying talks, no gestures that crossed any lines. But to Ryan, whatever was happening between him and Grace felt certain, even in silence. Everything was gentle, quiet, yet not vague. He didn't need proof, didn't need words to confirm it. He just knew the feeling was real. Then one day, he received an invitation to a small networking dinner hosted by a close group of friends. They were the ones who had known him long before success, the ones who'd shared the early startup years, drank cheap wine in his old garage, and stayed up all night pushing through their first project. He still kept in touch with them, just enough so they wouldn't drift apart, even though their lives had long taken different paths. Before leaving, he glanced at the dining table, where Grace was helping Noah pack his school bag. He didn't know what compelled him to walk over, but he did, and softly he said, "I'm going to a small dinner tonight. Old friends, nothing formal. If you're free, would you like to come?" Grace looked up, a brief pause in her movement, but her eyes didn't waver for long. She simply asked, "What's the dress code?" Ryan replied, "Casual. Just friends, nothing big." That afternoon, he didn't tell anyone he was bringing someone. When the car stopped in front of the restaurant, a few heads turned toward the woman stepping out beside him. No evening gown, no heavy makeup, no glitter. Just a soft blue dress, her hair tied low, a simple, unforced grace about her. One of his friends started to approach, ready to ask something. But before he could, Ryan smiled, turned toward Grace, and said clearly, without hesitation, "This is Grace. I think I'm in love." The words dropped into the room like a stone into still water. Every laugh, every clink of glasses, every note of background music seemed to stop midair. A few people froze, a few blinked, waiting for him to correct himself, to laugh and say it was just a joke. But Ryan didn't joke. He just stood there, not holding anyone's hand, not reaching for a kiss, not making a show of it. Yet every word he spoke carried a weight that silenced the entire room. None of his friends had ever heard him say he loved someone. Not because they weren't curious, but because they'd grown used to the idea that Ryan kept his heart locked away, a no-entry zone. Some had even bet he'd live alone forever. Others assumed he was simply too tired of relationships to care anymore. No one expected that the person who'd make him break that silence would be someone as quietly ordinary and quietly extraordinary as Grace. Bookmark. But Ryan didn't need anyone to believe him. He didn't feel the need to explain either. In a world of conditional handshakes and strategic relationships, he had chosen the one thing without any strategy at all: the truth. And the truth in that moment was that he wanted to stand beside Grace, in the open, under the light, among the people who had known him long before he became Ryan Moore. Not to show off, not to shock anyone, but to say, "This is the first real thing I've felt in a very long time." No one asked further questions. No one broke the silence that followed. They just looked at him, then at Grace, then back at him, as if trying to reimagine every definition they'd ever attached to him over the years. And perhaps, from that moment on, everyone understood. The stone heart that once made Ryan untouchable had finally opened. After that dinner, Ryan didn't appear in any headlines. There were no social media posts, no photos shared, no stories told. Everything that happened that night remained a private moment between real people, with no need to prove its existence to the world. But inside Ryan, that night marked a quiet turning point, a line drawn in time that needed no record, because he knew he'd never forget it. He sat in front of a simple camera, the backdrop a softly lit room, uncluttered and calm. His voice was slow, not the kind used to captivate an audience, but the kind that carries the weight of something lived and finally understood. I had everything, he said, and I thought I didn't need anyone. My life was a sequence of successful plans. I learned to control everything: time, money, people, emotions. I was confident I could live well without ever depending on love or anyone else. Everything around me was tidy, predictable, safe. No one could get close enough to hurt me. And then, a simple birthday card, one that expected nothing, showed me what it really means to be seen. It didn't come with a gift. It didn't carry praise. It didn't hide any expectation. Just 3 handwritten lines from someone who never tried to stand out, never needed recognition, and had no reason to do it, except that she saw me. Not the Ryan Moore everyone knew, but a man who sometimes didn't smile, who stayed too quiet, who thought maybe birthdays were just another day no one needed to remember. Grace wanted nothing from me, except me. She didn't need me to be more successful. She didn't need me to be richer or more famous or to change anything at all. She didn't love the image of me. She simply walked quietly beside me, not intruding into my life, but never letting me walk it alone. And I realized, all this time, maybe I had been living fully, but not completely. He paused for a moment, eyes lifted toward the camera, as if looking straight at someone on the other side. I want to ask you something. Is there someone in your life who quietly cares about you? Not for your money, not for your status? Have you ever believed that just one card could change a heart? You don't need grand gestures. You don't need drama. Sometimes simplicity is the most irresistible thing, because it isn't calculated. It doesn't try. It doesn't ask for anything in return. Ryan didn't say anything more. He just sat there for a few more seconds, then lowered his head slightly, a quiet gesture of gratitude, before the image slowly faded to black. There was no dramatic music, no closing line shaped into a slogan, only a lingering feeling that love doesn't come from the highest places or from anything shiny or expensive, but from the simplest things money can't buy. And maybe the only thing we really need to do is pause long enough to see it. Thank you for staying until the end of this story. In this fast-moving world, we often forget that the simplest things, a kind word, a handwritten card, a gesture expecting nothing in return, can move us more deeply than anything grand ever could. Love doesn't always begin with sparks or promises. Sometimes it begins when we are seen, truly seen, by someone who wants nothing from us, except who we really are. Leave a comment below. I'd love to hear what you felt. And don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss the next stories. Not stories told just to entertain, but to touch something real inside. Thank you for taking the time to listen. See you in the next story.